Hey everyone, welcome to another video. In this video we're going to have a look at the story of the Grand Inquisitor. So the Grand Inquisitor is the name of a poem that is written by one of the characters of Fyodor Dostoevsky's book called the Karamazov Brothers. So in this video I will first shortly discuss the book The Karamazov Brothers, then we will turn to the story of the Grand Inquisitor, and I think two aspects of this story are very important. Those are the three temptations of Christ, and the second one is the kiss. So the Karamazov Brothers is a beautifully written book in my opinion. Its main story is already remarkably interesting. It basically depicts the story of three brothers, Dmitri, Ivan and Alyosha, and their father has been violently murdered. And throughout the book, the reader, he or she will be wondering who of these brothers, if any of these brothers, is the guilty one. What is also really interesting is that these three brothers differ widely from each other. Each of them has vastly different character and a very different religious and philosophical viewpoint. So Dmitri is very passionate and impulsive. Ivan is an intellectual and also very skeptic about religion, for example. And Alyosha, he's a monk and he's really religious. And it seems that Fyodor Dostoevsky, during most of his books, he really likes to let these characters interact with each other and then kind of let them discuss their religious and philosophical viewpoints with each other and then see which one makes the most sense according to Dostoevsky. The story of the Grand Inquisitor is a good example of this interaction between the very different characters. Grand Inquisitor is the name of a poem that was written by Ivan, so the non-religious character who tells the story to Alyosha, who is the religious character. And Alyosha will be the first one to hear this story that has been written by Ivan. So the story of the Grand Inquisitor is set in Sevilla, in Spain, in the 16th century during the Spanish Inquisition. So what fundamentally happens in the story is that Christ suddenly appears in Sevilla during this time of the Inquisition, and even though Christ himself, he doesn't say anything throughout the poem, his sudden occurrence and then especially the response to this occurrence creates a really interesting situation. Ivan explains to Alyosha that after so many years of waiting for the recurrence of Christ, a lot of people, they started to, kind of lose their faith and started to spread doubts about the existence of Christ, for example, while some other people, they remained very faithful to their religion, and those that remained faithful to their religion, they actually became even more ardent in their belief. So the main character of this poem is the Grand Inquisitor, and he's a cardinal who during his reign orders many heretics to be burned. So the reader would suspect that such a person who wants to burn other people in the name of God would be more than pleased with the return of Christ. However, as we will see, and this is also I think the main theme of this story, is that Christ's recurrence basically creates a lot of problems for the Grand Inquisitor and also for Christianity in general. So as soon as Christ appears, basically everyone, recognizes him without any effort. They kind of start to follow him. He just moves around silently. He doesn't really say anything, but he also performs several miracles. So he makes a blind man see, he raises a young child from the dead, and the Grand Inquisitor, he watches all of these miracles occur. However, he orders Christ to be arrested. And the people, they are so used to submission that they silently accept the arrest of Christ and just move on with their lives. So the Grand Inquisitor, he then goes to visit Christ in his cell, and he kind of asks him, why has he come? Why are you coming to hinder us in our efforts? And then he also mentions Christ that he's going to burn him as a heretic at the stake the next day. And the Grand Inquisitor then also indicates that the people will join him in his condemnation of Christ because he is so powerful, because the Grand Inquisitor is so powerful, and the people will basically do whatever he will order of them, even if they have to burn Jesus Christ. And the Grand Inquisitor then goes on to explain to Christ why he's going to burn Christ. So he believes that Christ made a mistake 1500 years ago, he made people free, which according to the Grand Inquisitor was too much of a burden for the people to bear. So he continues to indicate that the church, they kind of had to finish what Christ could not finish. So the Grand Inquisitor, he then indicates to Christ that the church has made people absolutely free by kind of taking their freedom away from them and controlling it for them. So the church has been doing this for 15 centuries, and now suddenly with the appearance of Christ, the Grand Inquisitor is afraid that the process that they have made will be in danger. And therefore the Grand Inquisitor indicates that thou didst reject the only way by which man might be made happy, but fortunately, departing, thou didst hand on the work to us. Thou hast promised, thou hast established by thy word, thou hast given to us the right to bind and to unbind, and now, of course, thou canst not think of taking it away. Why then hast to come to hinder us? So what we have seen so far is that kind of the church, and then especially the Grand Inquisitor in this case, believe that Christ had made some mistakes in the past, and that the church is now in the process of correcting these mistakes, and that suddenly the reoccurrence of Christ can kind of be a threat to the progress that they have already made. So according to the Grand Inquisitor, there are a few ways in which Christ has made a mistake. So during Christ's temptation in the desert, Satan, he asked Christ 3 questions, or he kind of gave Christ 3 temptations. And according to the Grand Inquisitor, these 3 questions were really important, and if Christ would have answered them correctly, so in a different way, then the world would have been a better place according to the Grand Inquisitor. And now because Christ made this mistake, the church is kind of correcting these mistakes that he's made. And yeah, these are some very important questions. So the Grand Inquisitor, he argues that from those questions alone, from the miracle of their statement, we can see that we have here to do not with the fleeting human intelligence, but with the absolute and eternal. For in those 3 questions, the whole subsequent history of mankind is, as it were, brought together into one whole and foretold, and in them are united all the unsolved historical contradictions of human nature. So what are these 3 important questions or temptations? Well, the first one is that Satan tempted Christ to turn stones into bread. This would have been, of course, a very big temptation, because Satan argued that if Christ would turn stones into bread, then people would follow him wherever he went if they would witness this miracle. It would basically give Christ immense power. Christ, however, rejected this temptation because he thought it would cost people their freedom. If he would do so, then people would kind of be forced to follow him, and they would not really have any choice any longer. And Christ, he argued that people live not only by bread. The Grand Inquisitor, however, indicated that this response of Christ was a mistake, because he argued that people simply wanted to be fed, even if it were to cost them their freedom. So the Grand Inquisitor, he says that in the end they will lay their freedom at our feet and say to us, make us your slaves, but feed us. So according to the Grand Inquisitor, the bread of heaven does not compare to the earthly bread, because the human race is weak and sinful, and they only want what is in front of them, and they do not have the patience to wait for the bread of heaven, if this means that they have to wait for the earthly bread. He also indicates to Christ that only a handful of people would be strong enough to follow him in his pursuit for the bread of heaven, and he then asks Christ what he would do with the millions that are not strong enough and have to remain hungry while they wait for the heavenly. So the Inquisitor, he then argues that the church, they will care for these numerous and weak, and thereby they will be making a huge sacrifice in the name of Christ. So he says that the people, they will marvel at us and look on us as gods, because we are ready to endure their freedom, which they have found so dreadful, and to roll over them. So awful it will seem to them to be free. But we shall tell them that we are thy servants, and rule them in thy name. We shall deceive them again, for we will not let thee come to us again. That deception will be our suffering, for we shall be forced to lie. So in this sense, the Inquisitor argues that he will be doing the people a favor by condemning Christ to death. And the second temptation is kind of similar to the first one. So what basically happened is that Satan tempted Christ to jump from a temple. And if Christ would do so, then he would be saved by the angels. And then the people would be happy because they would witness a miracle. And Christ, he refused this second temptation as well. And by refusing to enact a miracle, the Grand Inquisitor argued that Christ did not fulfill the wishes of man. Therefore he indicated, for man seeks not so much God as the miraculous, and as man cannot bear to be without the miraculous, he will create new miracles of his own for himself, and will worship deeds of sorcery and witchcraft, though he might be 100 times over rebel, heretic and infidel. And thereby the Grand Inquisitor, he argues basically that Christ, by not embodying the miraculous, planted the seeds for heresy in man. And it's now up to the church to correct this mistake. And then the last temptation of Satan for Christ was that he was offered to rule over all the kingdoms of the earth. And Christ, he refused to do so as well, which according to the Inquisitor was also a huge mistake. So he mentions that hadst thou accepted that last gift of the mighty Spirit, thou wouldst have accomplished all that man seeks on earth. That is, someone to worship, someone to keep his conscience, and some means of uniting all in one unanimous and harmonious ant-heap. For the craving for universal unity is the third and last anguish of man. The Inquisitor, he argues that as long as this universal unity is not achieved, then man will continue to strive for it, and thereby universal peace can never be achieved if there is no universal unity. And therefore the Grand Inquisitor argued that Christ kind of had the possibility to achieve this universal peace, but was too proud to accept this gift. What we've seen so far is that Satan tempted Christ in three ways, and Christ has rejected these three temptations. And according to the Inquisitor, Christ has made a great mistake in rejecting these temptations. He believes that man has three desires, which are obedience, miracles, and worship. And if Christ had accepted these three temptations, he had the possibility to fulfill all of these desires for man. And by refusing Satan, the Grand Inquisitor argues that Christ has kind of doomed mankind to eternal insecurity, struggle, and emptiness. And according to the Inquisitor, the Church has stepped in to correct this mistake and offered man someone to obey, and provided man with miracles and also gave them someone to worship. And in this sense, the Inquisitor, by reversing the actions of Christ, thought he was doing mankind a favor in a sense. What has basically happened is that the Inquisitor argues that Christ kind of misjudged the nature of man. So Christ believed that mankind wanted to be free, that they wanted to, make sacrifices for the heavenly bread. But according to the Inquisitor, this is not what mankind wants. Mankind, they do not want to be free, they want to obey, they want to follow someone. And, Christ did not really see this according to the Grand Inquisitor. And then suddenly, after the Inquisitor had finished, speaking for quite a long time, as you have seen, then Christ, who has remained silent, he didn't really answer him. He just suddenly approached the Inquisitor and kissed him on his lips, and that was basically the answer of Christ. And then in response to this kiss, the Inquisitor, he decides to free Christ. However, he orders him never to return. I am personally not really sure how I should interpret this kiss. If you have any idea, then please let me know in the comments below. I personally think that maybe by kissing the Inquisitor and then the response of the Inquisitor to this kiss, Christ kind of proved his point that there are still good left in mankind, that mankind does not simply want to be ruled and wants to obey, but that they still want to kind of search for the heavenly bread, so the kingdom of heaven, And the Inquisitor, he kind of proves the point of Christ by not burning Christ, but just setting him free. So yeah, that was a rather long discussion. I think it's really interesting to ask a similar question. What would happen if Christ were to return today, or any other kind of savior would come? I think that the point of this entire poem is to indicate that even if a savior, whether this is Christ or someone else, if he or she might come, then this person might be silenced because he or she is too much of a disruptive force to the status quo. I definitely don't think that we should interpret this story in any anti-religious sense, because Dostoevsky was himself really religious. Instead, I think that the story tells us that we should be very mindful that these institutions that we have created to represent our interest might actually eventually act contrary to our interest. And these institutions can then be, for example, the state, or as in this story, it is the church. And they might act contrary to our interest because they want to maintain their power. And if such a true savior or Christ may come, then they might decide to kind of burn these saviors because they are too much of a disruptive force. So this might be the case with religious institutions or with governments. And what makes it even more interesting and more complicated is that these institutions, similarly to the church and the Grand Inquisitor in the story of the Grand Inquisitor, is that these institutions might think that they are actually doing mankind a favor by taking away their freedom. And yeah, who knows, perhaps they might actually be doing mankind a favor. So on page 278 we can read, "They have set up gods and challenge one another, put away your gods and come and worship ours, or we will kill you and your gods. And so it will be to the end of the world. Even when gods disappear from the earth, they will fall down before idols just the same." So in this sense, perhaps freedom is not really what we want and need, and the Grand Inquisitor might be right that we humans only want to have obedience, miracles, and worship somebody. Thank you very much for watching this video. I'm really curious what you think about the kiss in this story. What is the importance of the kiss? And I'm also really curious what you think about the opinions of the Grand Inquisitor. Do you think he is correct in arguing that humans only want to obey somebody, and that they only want to see miracles, and they only want to worship somebody? Or do you think that humans want and should be free? So yeah, thank you very much, and I hope to see you in the next video as well.